Mr. Farage, again, I think he tries to utilize the everlasting reality that any PR is good PR, especially in his situation. He's trying to remain irrelevant. So these comments basically are screaming in the dark.
Nigel Farage has called for peace negotiations to try to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. The Reform leader faced criticism for arguing that the EU and NATO gave President Putin a reason to justify his invasion of Ukraine to the Russian people. Well, speaking in Maidstone this morning, the Reform UK leader doubled down on his statement.
The fact that I was more far-sighted than the rest of our political leaders is not something that I'm going to apologise for. And yet this has been turned into Farage makes outrageous statement. Farage defends Putin. Well, I've done none of those things. I would never, ever defend Putin and think his behaviour in Ukraine and elsewhere has been reprehensible.
Well, I've been speaking to Sviatoslav Yurash, who's a Ukrainian MP and soldier, and I asked him what he made of Nigel Farage's call for peace talks with Russia.
Useful idiots come in all shapes and sizes. And as Mr. Lenin and his comrades try to utilize useful idiots from the left, so we see the useful idiots on the right these days as well. And Mr. Farage is, he is doing all he can to get attention to himself before the UK elections and grab as big of a percentage from the Conservative vote as he can, and making all kinds of statements, I guess, is his strategy in the situation. But Mr. Putin is very clearly the person to look to in this discussion, because he doesn't want peace. He's shown that by making outrageous demands for the start of any kind of conversation, and very obviously he doesn't intend that. And we don't intend to submit as well, so we'll fight back until he leaves us alone.
Nigel Farage's comments on this have been condemned both by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer. Has there been much coverage of it? Have these words reached Ukrainian people?
Yes, I've seen these comments, but Mr. Farage, again, I think he tries to utilize the everlasting reality that any PR is good PR, especially in his situation. He's trying to remain irrelevant. So these comments basically are screaming in the dark.
But these comments do also echo very similar remarks made by Donald Trump, who could well get back into power in the United States. Are you concerned, or is there concern there in Ukraine, that there could be pressure from the West to find a way of coming to an accommodation with Russia?
Well, let's start with Donald Trump. He makes all kinds of comments in all directions every day of the week, and especially no matter what he will do on day one when he takes office. And so it's very important to remember that Mr. Trump's words and Mr. Trump's actions are very often not as aligned as you can imagine. Second, that's why we are blessed in this reality with the state and functioning foreign policy, and will continue discussing and convincing, no matter who the elections that are happening in different Western countries this year will put in charge of your nations. And so for us, the reality is that as far as the UK is concerned, it's important to remember what's the reason for the comments. That is Nigel Farage's attempt to get as big of a percentage point from the Conservatives before the elections come.
What would you say, though, to people listening who say, well, look, this war has been going on for more than 2 years. There's been horrendous loss of life. There hasn't been huge movement along those key front lines along the east of your country for quite some time. And perhaps it is time to try to find a peaceful solution, because after all wars in the end do end with negotiations.
That's exactly why we held a 100-nation organization summit in Switzerland last week, and essentially with that exact goal in mind, and wanting to put more pressure onto Russia so the Russians leave us alone. We must remember what Russia has done, has aimed for here. It is about destruction of Ukrainian state, and Russia has cut out different chunks of our nation through all these events and killed immense numbers of people in all of this situation. The reality is, if we don't fight back, Russia will continue on, as we've seen after negotiating for Russia for the first 8 years of the conflict after the Russian invasion in 2014. Russia has responded to those negotiations with full-scale invasion in 2022. And seeing that happen, it's very important to remember that agreements with Russia is not backed up by force, by states coming together and joining with the righteous cause of nations governing themselves and deciding what nations become, is meaningless.
But just explain to people listening then, what is the difference between the sort of peace which you were discussing at that big summit, which included many Western allies, and the sort of peace which you think that Nigel Farage might be looking for?
I don't think Nigel Farage is looking for peace. I think he's looking for relevance, and I think his comments should be examined from that perspective, from the perspective of British politics, and him trying to find niche in that conversation. As far as Nigel Farage's point on the reality of Ukraine, it's important to remember that he hasn't been a part of the conversation, and he doesn't understand very much of what's happening and what this war already is and what it does cost and what it will cost to all of us going forward. And the reality that we are blessed with UK politics in which major political forces are aligned with supporting our nation, our struggle against the imperial designs of Russia as it is destroying our country and killing our people.
Yes, as I mentioned, Rishi Sunak, of course, has been stressing his support and providing support for Ukraine. Keir Starmer has said that will continue if he becomes the next Prime Minister. Is what you're saying then that Russia has to withdraw from all Ukrainian territory before you would be prepared to consider some kind of peace negotiations?
Well, it's not what we are saying, and our point is very simple. All of the world recognizes Ukraine's sovereignty over all of the parts of Ukraine which hoped to become independent in the referendum in 1991. Russia has illegally attacked and annexed different parts of our country starting in 2014. And our point here is that we have, if national law should mean anything, it is being tested here right now in Ukraine. And by fighting back, we are not allowing imperial designs of Russia's to happen, but also showing other aggressive autocracies or dictatorships that their delusions about what they think the nations should be will become. And that's why it's very important not just to remember about Ukraine, but also remember about the fact that the world's watching. And if you give Putin a bit for all that he has tried to destroy and take, you will teach other dictators that they can also try their luck and get something in the end.
Well, that was Sviatoslav Yurash, who's a Ukrainian MP and soldier, speaking to me just a little earlier